The night was thick with silence, save for the muffled cries inside a modest hut on the village's outskirts. Ayana clutched her mother's trembling hands, her heart hammering in her chest as her father stood in the doorway, his face carved from stone, yet his eyes filled with torment. Outside, the sound of horses stamping against the dirt sent chills down her spine. They were waiting. The chief's men had come to collect the price of her father's misfortune. Her father had been a proud man once, a skilled craftsman whose hands carved beauty from the most stubborn wood. But misfortune had stalked him like a hungry beast. A deal gone bad, a debt that had only grown with time, and soon, Chief Okoro, ruler of the neighboring lands, feared and revered in equal measure, had come to collect. He had given her father a choice. Surrender his land, his last claim to dignity, or give something of equal worth. And the chief had already decided what that was. Ayana had always known Chief Okoro's name. It was whispered in fearful reverence, spoken in cautious tones by those who knew the weight of his power. He was not just a ruler, he was a conqueror. He took what he wanted, and none dared refuse him. And now, he had set his eyes on her. The moment her father had agreed to the trade, Ayana's fate had been sealed. No matter how much her mother wept, no matter how much Ayana's hands ached from clenching the fabric of her dress, nothing could change what was coming. Her father had sold her for survival, and now, she belonged to Okoro. Two men stepped into the hut, their faces hidden beneath the dim torchlight. One reached for her arm, his grip firm but not cruel. Ayana wanted to fight, to claw her way out, to run until her legs gave out. But there was nowhere to go. Not when her father had already made his decision. Her mother let out a strangled sob as Ayana was pulled toward the doorway, the warm comfort of home slipping from her grasp. She did not scream. She did not beg. If this was to be her fate, she would not let them see her break. The ride to Chief Okoro's stronghold was long and cold, the night air biting against her skin. She sat rigid on the back of a horse, sandwiched between two of the chief's men, the thick scent of leather and sweat suffocating her senses. The forest swallowed them whole, the towering trees casting long shadows under the pale light of the moon. With every mile they traveled, the weight of what awaited her grew heavier. She was being taken to a world where power ruled over kindness, where men like Okoro dictated the fate of those beneath them with a mere word. But she would not make it easy for him. She had no choice but to go, but she vowed one thing: she would never belong to him. The compound loomed ahead, a massive fortress of carved stone and towering wooden gates, guarded by men whose faces were as unreadable as the night. Torches flickered against the thick walls, casting eerie shadows across the courtyard as Ayana was led inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt it, the weight of the place, heavy with power and unseen chains. Women lined the walkways, some draped in the finest silks, adorned with golden bracelets and beads that clicked softly with each movement. Others, less fortunate, kept their heads lowered, their gazes fleeting. The moment they saw her, the whispers began. Some murmured in envy, their eyes raking over her like she was fresh meat. Others exchanged glances filled with something close to pity. "She's the new one," someone whispered. "The chief's latest prize." Ayana's jaw tightened. She refused to be anyone's prize. The guards led her deeper into the compound, past towering pillars and lavishly decorated halls. The scent of burning incense hung thick in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of exotic spices. She could hear distant laughter from another wing of the palace, the sound of drums echoing from the main hall where a feast was surely taking place. Then, they stopped. Before her, seated upon an ornately carved wooden throne, was Chief Okoro. He was larger than she had imagined, his presence filling the room like a storm waiting to strike. His dark eyes bore into her, unblinking, unreadable. He wore only a ceremonial wrap around his waist, his broad chest adorned with intricate necklaces of gold and ivory. Everything about him screamed dominance, control, power. For a moment, silence stretched between them. She knew she should kneel. The guards who had escorted her had already stepped back, their heads bowed in deference. Every woman in the room had her eyes lowered, unwilling to meet his gaze. But Ayana did not move. The defiance was instinctive, reckless even. But she had already lost everything, her family, her freedom. The only thing she had left was herself. Okoro's lips twitched, amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "You do not kneel before your chief?" His voice was deep, commanding, carrying the weight of authority. Ayana lifted her chin. "I was taken from my home like a stolen goat. Do you expect me to bow like a grateful servant?" A sharp intake of breath echoed from somewhere in the room. One of the older women, draped in fine silk, turned her head sharply, as if expecting Okoro to strike her down on the spot. The chief did not rise from his throne, nor did his expression darken with anger. Instead, something else flickered in his gaze, interest. A slow smile curled at the edge of his lips. "You have fire," he murmured. "I like that." Ayana remained still, her heart pounding. She had expected rage, expected him to punish her insolence immediately. But instead, he seemed entertained. He rose from his throne with a measured grace, stepping toward her. He towered over her, his presence suffocating. He reached out, gently tracing a single finger beneath her chin, tilting her face up to meet his. "You are mine now," he said softly, almost as if he were testing how the words would taste in the air. "You will learn." Ayana clenched her fists, her skin burning where his touch lingered. "I am no one's possession," she whispered. Okoro let out a quiet chuckle, low and rich. "We shall see." He turned away from her then, addressing the women gathered around them. "Prepare her. Make her presentable." A woman, older than the others, stepped forward and took Ayana's arm. There was no kindness in her grip, only duty. As she was led away, Ayana felt the weight of Okoro's gaze on her back. He would not force her. Not yet. He had decided to make a game of it, to turn her submission into a slow, cruel game of dominance and control. But if he thought she would break easily, he was mistaken. The days in the chief's domain bled into nights, each one heavier than the last. Ayana was surrounded by wealth, but it meant nothing to her. Silk cushions, golden bangles, trays of rich food, it was all part of a world she refused to accept. She did not smile. She did not bow. She did not succumb. The first time Okoro sent gifts to her chamber, she left them untouched. The second time, she sent them back. The third time, she threw the delicate beaded necklace onto the floor, letting the tiny jewels scatter like broken promises. Whispers followed her everywhere. "She is a fool," one of the concubines muttered. "The chief will tire of her," another said, smirking. "And when he does, she will learn regret." But Ayana did not care for their warnings. She had already been taken from her home, stripped of choice. What more could they do to her? Then, the punishments began. The lavish meals stopped coming. Her chamber, once warm with the scent of burning incense and fresh flowers, was stripped of comfort. She was left with only a thin mat on the cold floor. Days passed, and her stomach twisted with hunger, but still, she did not yield. One evening, the women of the chief's household gathered for a feast. Music filled the halls, laughter spilling into the air like perfume. Yet Ayana was given nothing. She sat alone in the corner, watching as food was passed around, steaming bowls of stew and roasted meats, the scent making her stomach ache. A servant girl, young and timid, hesitated before her. In her hands was a small bowl of porridge, plain and unseasoned. She placed it before Ayana with an apologetic glance. "This is all I was told to bring," the girl whispered. Ayana did not touch it. She lifted her gaze across the hall, where Okoro sat at the head of the long table, surrounded by women who leaned close, offering him wine and soft words. But his eyes were not on them. They were on her. He was watching. Waiting. She held his gaze, refusing to look away, even as her stomach clenched painfully. His lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. A test. That's what this was. "Let me see how much you can endure." But Ayana would not give him the satisfaction. The days wore on, and her defiance did not waver. Okoro, for all his patience, should have grown tired of the game by now. But he did not. Instead, he seemed drawn to it, to her. When he walked past, he did not ignore her as he did the others. His gaze lingered. When he spoke to her, his voice was measured, as if savoring each word. "You have the pride of a lion," he murmured one night, as they stood alone in the courtyard. The sky above them was endless, stars flickering like distant embers. But even lions know when to submit. Ayana turned to him, fire in her eyes. A caged lion is still a lion. It does not forget. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against her wrist, just for a moment. It was not an act of force, nor a demand. It was something else. Something neither of them yet understood. Then, just as quickly, he withdrew. As Ayana returned to her chamber, her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. The game between them had shifted. The power struggle was no longer one-sided. And she was beginning to realize that she was not the only one who was fighting. The village was alive with celebration. Drums pounded in the distance, their deep rhythm pulsing through the earth. Fires blazed in tall pits, illuminating the night in hues of gold and red. Laughter and music intertwined as people swayed and spun, their voices rising in song. Ayana had no choice but to be there. Dressed in gold-trimmed silk that clung to her form, she felt like a prized jewel on display. Her hair was woven with delicate beads, her wrists heavy with gold bangles that jingled with every step. The chief's mark was all over her, even though she had never given herself to him. Okoro sat at the high table, surrounded by his warriors, his other wives, and the elders. He looked like a king surveying his kingdom, his presence commanding without effort. But his attention was not on the feast before him. It was on her. She felt his gaze even before she met it. His eyes, dark as the night sky, followed her every movement. There was something different in them tonight, not just possession, but something deeper, something heavier. She refused to look away. The music changed, the tempo rising. Women stepped into the open space before the fire, their bodies moving in perfect harmony with the rhythm. It was a dance of celebration, of power, of life. Ayana should have stayed back. She should have remained in the shadows, invisible. But something inside her burned with defiance. If he wanted her to be his prize, she would show him that she was more than something to be owned. She stepped forward, letting the music guide her. Her body moved in a way that felt natural, fluid. The air grew thick with heat, the flickering flames casting wild shadows across her skin. The crowd cheered, entranced by the dance, but she only focused on one pair of eyes. Okoro leaned forward, his expression unreadable, his grip tightening around the carved armrest of his chair. She saw it then, desire. Not just the desire of a man used to taking what he wanted, but something different. Something dangerous. The chief was no stranger to women throwing themselves at his feet, eager to please him. But Ayana was not one of them. And that was what made her intoxicating. When the dance ended, a silence hung in the air, thick and charged. Ayana turned away, willing herself to breathe normally, to steady the wild pounding of her heart. But before she could slip away, a strong hand caught her wrist. She froze. She knew who it was before she even turned. Okoro's fingers were firm yet careful, his grip neither cruel nor forceful. "You think this is a game?" His voice was low, rough, barely above a whisper. Ayana lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "I think it is a game you are losing." His eyes darkened, his thumb grazing over the pulse at her wrist. "No woman has ever defied me the way you do. Perhaps that is because no woman before me has ever seen you for what you are." He let out a slow breath, something flickering in his expression. Then, suddenly, he pulled her closer, his heat pressing against her. The air between them was molten, heavy with something unspoken. "You will be mine," he murmured. "One way or another." Ayana's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "You may own my body, but you will never own me." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, his lips curved into something almost dangerous. "We shall see." And with that, he released her. Ayana turned, walking away before he could see the way her fingers trembled. The battle between them had begun. And she was no longer sure who would win. The night was thick with silence, the kind that carried hidden danger. The moon cast a silver glow over the compound, its light stretching long shadows across the thatched roofs and stone pathways. Most of the household had long retired, their laughter and songs from the evening feast fading into the quiet hum of the wind. Ayana lay awake in her quarters, her thoughts restless. The tension between her and Chief Okoro had reached a boiling point, yet she could not decipher what it meant. He wanted her, of that, there was no doubt. But there was something else in his eyes now, something deeper than mere possession. And that terrified her more than anything. A sudden rustling outside the hut made her stiffen. She turned her head, listening carefully. The guards rarely patrolled this late into the night, and the other women would have no reason to linger. Then she heard it, the faint scrape of a blade against wood. Before she could react, a hand clamped over her mouth. She thrashed instinctively, but strong arms pinned her down. The scent of sweat and earth filled her senses. A deep voice hissed in her ear. "Be still, or you'll make this worse." Her heart pounded against her ribs. The man's grip was firm but careful, as if he didn't intend to hurt her, at least not yet. In the dim moonlight, she caught a glimpse of their faces. They weren't Okoro's men. She was being taken. Panic surged through her veins, but she forced herself to stay still, to listen. "We have to move quickly," another man muttered. "The chief's warriors will notice soon." "She's lighter than I thought," the one holding her whispered. "I expected a fighter." Ayana bit down on his hand without hesitation. He cursed under his breath, but didn't let go. She was lifted from her bed and slung over a shoulder. The ground disappeared beneath her as the warriors carried her through the compound's hidden paths, avoiding the watchful eyes of the night guards. She thought of screaming, of thrashing, of doing anything to alert someone. But what if these men were sent by her father? What if this was her only chance at freedom? The thought stilled her. She kept her breathing even, listening for any clue that might tell her who they were. Minutes felt like hours as they slipped past the compound's walls, vanishing into the forest beyond. The moment they were far enough, the leader finally set her down. Ayana gasped for air, her hands balled into fists as she took in her captors, 5 warriors dressed in unfamiliar colors. Their faces were hardened, their eyes sharp. "Who are you?" she demanded, forcing her voice to remain steady. The leader stepped forward. "We are doing you a favor, girl. You should be thanking us." Ayana's stomach twisted. "Who sent you?" A slow smirk spread across his face. "Chief Malik." Her breath caught. Malik. The enemy of Okoro. A man even more feared than the chief himself. Cold fear gripped her. She had been a fool to believe she was being rescued. "You will not be harmed," the leader continued, "but you are valuable to us. Your presence will force Okoro to negotiate." Her blood ran cold. She wasn't being saved. She was a pawn in a battle far greater than herself. And now, she was in more danger than ever before. The flames of war licked the sky, turning the night into a battlefield of fire and blood. The moment Chief Okoro had learned of Ayana's abduction, his fury had been unmatched. He had fought many wars, taken many prizes, and ruled with an iron fist, but the thought of someone taking her, that was something he could not allow. His warriors moved like shadows through the trees, their bodies painted in the dark hues of war. The drums of battle thundered in the distance as they closed in on Chief Malik's camp. The enemy had underestimated him, believing he would negotiate. They had not known what it meant to steal from Okoro. Inside the camp, Ayana sat with her back against the wooden post of a large tent. She had been bound but not harmed. Malik knew her worth. He had come to her only once, his voice dripping with smug certainty. "Your chief will come for you," he had said. "But he will not win." Ayana had stared at him, refusing to show fear. She had survived Okoro, she had survived betrayal, and she would survive this. What she had not expected was the way her heart leaped at the sound of the first war cry. The attack came swift and brutal. Malik's men barely had time to react before Okoro's warriors stormed the camp. The clash of metal and bone filled the air, the screams of dying men echoing into the night. Tents collapsed under the weight of destruction, and bodies fell like leaves in the wind. Ayana struggled against her bindings, her breath hitching as she saw a familiar figure moving through the carnage. Okoro was a vision of wrath, his chest bare, his dark skin streaked with war paint and blood. His sword cut through enemies with merciless precision, his eyes ablaze with something deeper than fury. He was not fighting for conquest. He was fighting for her. Malik emerged, blade drawn, his lips curled into a sneer. You think I will surrender her so easily? Okoro did not answer with words, only steel. Their swords clashed, the force of their battle sending shockwaves through the ground. Malik was strong, but Okoro was unstoppable, fueled by something more than power. Ayana's hands went numb as she watched the battle unfold. She had never seen the chief fight before, not like this. He was a warrior, a beast, a storm that could not be contained. And yet, in the midst of all this chaos, all she could think about was what it meant. She was no longer just a debt repaid. She had become something far more dangerous. With a final blow, Okoro drove his blade into Malik's chest. The rival chief staggered, his body falling to the ground, lifeless. Silence followed, broken only by the crackling fires around them. Okoro turned, his breath heavy, his eyes locking onto Ayana. She did not flinch. He moved toward her, cutting the ropes that bound her wrists, but he did not touch her. Instead, he knelt before her, his hands resting on his thighs. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. You are mine. The words sent a shiver down her spine, but not from fear. She had expected possession, dominance, the arrogance of a man who believed she belonged to him. But what she saw in his eyes was different. It was not just ownership. It was need. Ayana rose slowly, rubbing the marks on her wrists. The battle had been fought, the enemy slain, and yet this moment felt heavier than all of it. She met his gaze, standing tall. I will not return as a possession, she said, her voice steady. If you want me, you must let me choose. Okoro's jaw tightened. The warlord in him was not used to being defied. But the man in him, the one who had crossed blood and fire to reach her, knew she had already won. He exhaled, standing to his full height, towering over her. Then choose, Ayana. And for the first time, she realized that the power had shifted. The choice was hers. The chief's compound was not the same place Ayana had left. Or perhaps it was she who had changed. The moment she stepped inside, the air felt different. The eyes that once viewed her with scorn or pity now held something else, curiosity, perhaps even respect. She had left as a captive and returned as something unspoken, something neither she nor they could yet define. Chief Okoro stood at the center of it all, his presence as commanding as ever. But there was something different in the way he looked at her now. The triumph in his gaze had faded, replaced by something heavier. The women of the compound gathered in hushed anticipation. Naima, one of his more favored concubines, narrowed her eyes, arms crossed tightly. Others exchanged whispers, waiting for the moment they had all expected, the moment Ayana would be claimed. Instead, Okoro did something that stunned them all. He stepped forward, close enough for his warmth to reach her skin, yet he did not touch her. His voice, always deep and commanding, held a weight it had never carried before. You are free to go. A ripple of shock passed through the women. No one had expected this, not after the war he had waged to get her back. Ayana stared at him, her heart pounding. What are you saying? Okoro exhaled, the muscle in his jaw tightening. I took you as payment for a debt. I saw you as something to claim, something to tame. But I was wrong. His gaze burned into hers, unreadable. I do not want a prisoner at my side. If you stay, it will be because you choose it. The courtyard fell silent. No one moved, no one breathed. Freedom. The very thing she had fought for from the moment she had been dragged into this place. The thing she had dreamed of every night as she lay on cold silk sheets, caged in luxury. It was right there, in her grasp. She could walk away. Return to the village, to her family, to the life she had once known. And yet, Ayana turned her gaze to the women watching her, to the compound that had once felt like a prison. But was it still? She had spent so much time resisting, pushing back, surviving. She had refused to be broken, refused to be owned. But in her defiance, she had become something else, something more than just a captive. And Okoro. He was still the same powerful, dangerous man he had always been. But he had changed, too. Not in his strength, not in his dominance, but in the way he looked at her now. As if she was no longer a possession to be kept, but a force to be reckoned with. The women waited. The warriors watched. Even the wind seemed to still. Ayana lifted her chin. And if I stay? Something flickered in Okoro's eyes, something sharp and knowing. Then you will be more than what you were brought here to be. It was not a plea. It was not a demand. It was an offer. A choice. And for the first time in her life, Ayana realized the power was in her hands. The compound, once her prison, now stood as something different. The walls had not changed, nor had the people within them. But Ayana had. She turned, her gaze locking onto Okoro's. The women, the warriors, the entire court seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her answer. Then, in a single step, she moved, not away, but toward him. A murmur swept through the crowd. Okoro's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes burned with something fierce and unspoken. I will not be a possession, Ayana said, her voice steady, clear. I will not be tamed. If I stay, it is not as something to be claimed, but as your equal. The courtyard remained deathly silent. Then, slowly, Okoro inclined his head. A silent acknowledgement. A king recognizing the power of the woman before him. And with that, everything changed. The women of the compound, who had once whispered about her as a powerless girl, now lowered their heads in quiet respect. Even Naima, who had once plotted against her, could say nothing. The warriors who had fought beside Okoro saw not just a chief's prize, but a force standing beside him. The transformation was not in titles or gifts, not in fine silks or golden ornaments. It was in the way the air shifted when she walked, in the way eyes followed her now, not out of mockery, but reverence. She had not been broken. She had risen. As the sun set over the horizon, Okoro turned to his people and spoke words that would mark the beginning of something new. The woman you see before you is not here by force. She stands here by choice. And a choice made in strength is greater than any conquest. His gaze flickered back to her, something unspoken passing between them. Ayana did not smile, nor did she bow. She stood tall. For she was never meant to be just another woman in the chief's hut. She was meant to be a queen.